Hello, I'm Jake Klingensmith. I'm a beekeeper and instructor at the Plowshare. I've been beekeeping for the past 13 years and have around 80 hives. I've been working with the Top Bar Hive here recently to develop a more simple and sustainable family hive. Today I want to talk about the importance of honeybees. When we think of honeybees, we think of the sweet golden honey that bees produce. Honey is an all-natural sweetener with many different beneficial properties. Bees gather nectar from flowers. They take the nectar back to their hive where they turn it into honey. Honey is not the only reason honeybees are important. As honeybees gather nectar and pollen from flowers for food, they are also pollinating the plants. Honeybees are not the only insects that are useful for pollination. There are many others, such as bumblebees, mason bees, butterflies, and more. All these other insects cannot be relied upon as a main source for crop pollination for several reasons. One, they do not live year-round and are not able to pollinate some of the crops that bloom in the early spring. Two, butterflies do not eat pollen, thus they prefer plants that produce sweeter nectar, skipping the less desirable plants. Three, because bumblebees do not live as a colony year-round, they do not need to store up large amounts of nectar and pollen, and they do not pollinate very many flowers. A bumblebee queen will start a nest in the early spring. The nest will grow to be a colony in the early summer. Then as the weather cools, in the fall, the bumblebee colony will die off. Our gardens and orchards depend on bees to pollinate the flowers in order to set fruit. An almond blossom will not set fruit if it does not get pollinated by bees, nor will tart or sweet cherries. A cucumber blossom is open for only one day. If the blossom is not visited that day, it will not set fruit. There are over 90 different crops in the U.S. that depend on bees for pollination. Some plants need to be visited several times in order to be properly pollinated. If an apple is not visited by 5 or 6 bees, the apple will only have a few seeds in it. The seeds cause the meat of the apple to grow. A good apple has about 8 to 10 seeds in it. If it has less, the apple will be small and misshaped. Let's take a look at a few different apples here. Here we have an apple that seems like it wasn't properly pollinated. You can see it's small on one side and larger on the other. It was probably pollinated 5 to 6 times, and the seeds are in this side, and there are probably not any in this side. Here we've got some nicely shaped apples that seem like they were properly pollinated. Okay, let's cut this apple open here. You can see here how the seeds were in the larger side and there aren't any seeds in the small side. We've got here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seeds in this apple. This is direct results of poor pollination. A good apple should have 10 seeds. That's why this one was small on one side and larger on the other. Let's take a look at one of these bigger apples here. This one seems to have been properly pollinated. Let's cut it open. Okay, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 seeds in this apple. So we can see the direct results of pollination here. We've got an apple here that was pollinated by 8 bees, healthy and big, and we've got an apple over here that was not pollinated the proper amount of times and it was small and misshapen. Bees are also very important to seed saving. There are several crops that are harvested before they ever produce seeds, such as carrots, cabbage, onions, radishes. In order to save the seeds for the next year, these plants need to be left until they flower. The flower must be pollinated by several bees in order to produce seeds. The seeds are then collected and saved to be planted. The bees need our gardens as much as we need them for pollination. During the hot, dry months of the year, when the wildflowers will not be in bloom, the bees will gather nectar from flowering vegetables in our garden. Pollen and nectar are the honeybee's main food source. Nectar is the bee's source of carbohydrate. The bees gather the nectar from flowers, they take it back to the hive and store it in their combs. The bees then fan their wings at the entrance of the hive, This causes the air to circulate through the hive and dehydrate the nectar. Then it turns into honey. The honey is then fed to the honeybee larvae and all the other bees. Pollen is their source of protein. It furnishes the bees with fat, amino acids, and minerals. As the bees gather nectar from the flowers, they become dusted with pollen. The bees then stop to comb the pollen out of their hair and into small baskets located on their hind legs. They continue on to the next flower to gather more nectar and pollen. Upon this flower, the bees will lose some of their pollen that they had just collected from the previous flower. Thus, the flower is pollinated. A beehive is very simple to manage. Throughout the year, the hive management will be similar to that of a garden, with not much to do in the winter and the activities increasing in the spring and summer as the flowers bloom. In the spring, when the flowers begin to bloom, the bees will collect the nectar and pollen as food for their hive. The more nectar they collect, the larger the hive will grow. On a good year, the bees will gather more nectar for honey than they will use in one winter. This extra honey is what the beekeeper will harvest for his own use. There are 4 basic reasons to manage a beehive. 1, it is important to check the hive for diseases. 2, as the hive grows throughout the year, you will need to manage the growth of the hive so it will not swarm. 3, you will need to watch the amount of food the hive has and feed when necessary. The 4th reason is to manage the hive to produce surplus honey, pollen, propolis, and wax. Let's take a look at these 4 products of the hive. Honey is the bee's main diet. Honey is gathered from flowers as nectar. The bees sip the nectar from flowers into their stomachs with their tongues. While the nectar is in the bee's stomachs, the bee will add enzymes from a gland in their stomach. Once the nectar has been turned into honey, the enzymes will preserve it from spoiling. They carry the nectar back to the hive where they place it in the combs. The nectar is about 85% water when it is first gathered. The bees must dehydrate the nectar to less than 18% moisture or the nectar will ferment. The bees dehydrate the nectar by fanning their wings at the entrance of the hive. This causes the air to circulate through the hive. After the bees have dehydrated the nectar, it is now honey. Now the bees will cap all the cells that are filled with honey with wax. This is how the beekeeper knows the honey is ready to be harvested. Pollen is the bee's source of protein. An average hive will gather 60 pounds of pollen in 1 year. Pollen is a powdery substance that comes from flowers. The pollen collects in the bee's hairy body while gathering nectar from flowers. The bee will stop every so often and comb the pollen out of its hair. The bee starts by wetting its front legs with nectar. It then combs the pollen from its head and thorax with its front legs. The nectar will cause the pollen dust to stick together. It will comb the pollen into baskets located on its back legs. The bee flies back to the hive where it drops the pollen into a cell. Propolis is a sticky resin that is collected from flower buds and trees. The bees gather propolis to seal cracks and polish the inside of the hive. The propolis has antibacterial properties which keep the hive clean. The bees are always cleaning their hive of any foreign matter. If an object is too big for the bees to remove from the hive, the bees will propolis it over. If a mouse should enter the hive, the bees will try to sting the mouse and chase it out. But if the mouse does not leave quickly, the bees will sting it to death. Because the dead mouse is too big for the bees to remove, they will propolis the mouse over. This will keep the hive from becoming contaminated with a dead mouse. Many people collect propolis from the hive for medicinal purposes. Wax is secreted from the abdomens of bees. The bees then use the wax to build their combs. The bees will hang on each other, forming a chain that hangs from the top of the hive. The bees will pass the scales of wax they secrete up the chain of bees. The bee at the top of the chain will then form the wax scales into cells. All these cells comprised together make the comb where they store the honey, pollen, and the metamorphosis of the honeybee takes place. So that's a general overview of bees and beekeeping. Bees are not that complicated. If you can garden, you can keep bees. In the next videos, we will cover the tools necessary for beekeeping, the different bees, the queen, the worker, and the drone. We'll talk about how to set up a hive, and much more.